Hey guys, so today's video is a redo of one that we done ages ago in text-to-speech, but I'm doing it and it's a really good story, so hope you enjoy and we'll see you at the end of the video. Our campaign started with only a bit of flourish. Our game master announced himself as the greatest god in Grand Pantheon, who dwelt in a time and space that no other god could reach, judging the deed of all lesser beings. By his hand the universe turned, and by his word all things trembled. This was actually rather subdued compared to his usual drama. We would each take the role of demigods, half-gods, barely gods, or however you want to say that we're not true gods. Our greatest power would be our immortality, which allowed us to walk within the realm of the greater gods, and also kept us from being truly killed by anything less than the terrible means it took to kill a god. Our bodies, no stronger than that of ordinary men, could still be destroyed in the mortal realm, but we would simply reform within the halls of the immortals. Our other powers depend on which god we would serve. After much discussion, we managed to settle on our characters. The first one to decide was the demigod Korg, a servant of the god of war. His choice of power was simply great strength. Next was Handelhan, a servant of the god of knowledge. His choice was the ability to read minds, and our game master made certain he understood that his power, and all of our powers, could not be used upon divine beings, but only mortals. After some thinking, Pleth came into being, as a servant of the god of nature. He could breathe motion into trees, allowing them to move accordingly to either his will or their own. Finally, I decided to serve the god of desire. As the burly god, I'm gonna pronounce that cum. I don't know about you guys, but CYM spells come to me. My ability would be to convince mortals that they can satisfy one of their desires with something else. If they were hungry, for instance, I could tell them that a glass of water would satisfy their hunger. With our characters set, our GM explained that though we served the gods, we also sought after their positions and power, and it was up to us to decide how to walk this twisted path of subservience and subterfuge. We four demigods easily saw the benefits of working together, and as Korg began to carve a stronghold at the top of the mountain with his bare hands, we discussed what method we would take to obtain true godhood. A century passed before Korg was satisfied with our citadel, but it took another 2 before our plan was ready to be set in motion. Handelhan spent his 3 centuries gathering lore about the gods, learning what he could about their natures. 10 of the largest chambers within our citadel became the library of god lore, filled with mortal scholars who thought that looking into the nature of divinity would reveal the truth of the world. Those scholars worked quite hard in their contemplations, but I dare say that though they revealed a great number of interesting truths about the gods, none of them died satisfied. Pleth was the wandering sort, and didn't actually like the mountain too much. He helped us in many ways, by providing our citadel with living furniture and shelves, and even managed to produce a tree that grew blank books rather than nuts or fruit. But beyond that, he was aloof and distant, only appearing once every decade or so to check on his trees. I think part of him was conflicted, in that he wondered if him becoming the god of nature was truly what was best for nature, and there were many times that I wish my power could work upon him. Korg spent his time after finishing our stronghold sleeping. He occasionally woke up, go down to the mountain, fight in whatever war was available, die, and then get resurrected and go back to sleep. I spent most of my time figuring out the limitations of my ability. The foremost restrictions was that I could only shift desires towards reasonable mistakes. I couldn't make someone who is tired desire running instead of sleeping, but I could make someone who really wanted bananas instead think they wanted plantains. I couldn't increase someone's desire, couldn't decrease their desires, and I think, though I'm not sure, but I think every time I used my power, the affected person became a little less happy. With 3 centuries of planning behind us, it was time to make our move, to establish ourselves as the new gods of war, knowledge, nature, and desire. Our first step was an overall decrease in worship. We had to reduce the power of the gods we served, in order to limit how much they could interfere with our plans. By reducing the amount of followers of these 4 gods, we could then proceed to form new sects of worshippers that worship particular aspects of the gods, with those aspects being us. Reducing nature worship was easy. With Korg at the head, we spent 50 years leading armies to destroy tribal cultures. Pleth, in order to not raise any suspicion in the gods he served, was absent from this campaign. That was also good for another reason, as we slaughtered many people of various levels of innocence who genuinely loved nature. It was during our last campaign that we encountered another demigod, one that tried to oppose us. Our army was beset by all manners of animals, and we would have been routed if Korg had not simply marched single-handedly into the enemy camp and crushed the enemy demigod by throwing a bison at him. To our good fortune, the demigod survived, albeit with his body in shambles, and after submitting him to some sedatives, Handlehan dragged him back to the library of godlore. With most tribal societies a fraction of the size they once were, the worship of nature had decreased rapidly. Pleth had been commanded by his god to do what he could for the remaining worshippers, and in only a decade there were small shrines dedicated to Pleth himself, though it was through an image of a tree with a large eye at the centre of its trunk. We tried for Desire next, yet it wasn't quite so easy. There were few people that outwardly worshipped Desire, as my god was not exactly one of the major players in the Grand Pantheon. The only shrines dedicated to Desire were small and often hidden, and all were rather sensual in design, which tended to actually detract from genuine worship. I knew it, his name's Cum. There's dildos, they're worshipping dildos, I'm telling you. We tried to tackle the issue of decreasing the worship of Desire by funding ascetic orders, but after 3 decades without a drop of change, we abandoned that idea. Perhaps our plan failed because the worship of Desire was small already, but I think it was more of a case that these ascetic orders just didn't have a large enough influence, and perhaps that providing them with additional funds, we actually managed to reduce their ability to resist Desire. Those 3 decades were not wasted, however. Pleth had gathered a decent-sized following, especially after Korg, in a new mantle, helped defend their tribes from the remnants of our old army. With a substantial amount of worshippers, Pleth obtained a new power, the ability to speed up the growth of trees from years to mere hours. In combination with the ability to animate them, Pleth could create a small army wherever he wanted one, but he had some misgivings about doing so. He didn't think it was wise to materialize the forces of nature, and we agreed to not press our luck with the forces we weren't in complete control of. Handlehan had also been rather busy, with the animal controlling Demigod's body under constant sedation, and a number of scholars working around the clock experimenting on it. He had major breakthroughs in being able to transfer divine essence from one person to another, though nothing truly useful just yet. But Handlehan promised us results by the end of the century. We put Desire on the back burner, and decided it would be a good time to focus on reducing the God of Knowledge's power. Handlehan went about this in a fairly straightforward manner, by going to each of the great schools and examining all of the teachers' minds, seeking out the most intelligent people. With my aid, we managed to convince them that they didn't actually want to teach anyone, but instead to continue their research elsewhere. We established an academy of all the brightest minds, and with both Handlehan and I working tirelessly, slowly pushing them towards researching things that would help our goals. The teachers who refused to join us, even after I tried to persuade them, and Handlehan tried to use his knowledge of their innermost secrets to blackmail them, were simply removed. After 40 years, the decrease in education and general knowledge was rather tangible, and Handlehan was summoned to a grand meeting of the God of Knowledge and all of the demigods that served him. Handlehan was spared any blame thanks to him having helped find one of the last bastions of knowledge. Even though our academy was more of an intellectual prison than anything else, without enough information for him to act, the God of Wisdom ended the meeting without deciding upon anything. The meeting did, however, prove rather useful to us, as Handlehan uncovered an opponent in the form of the demigod named Malian. Malian was correct in thinking Handlehan was actually working against the God of Wisdom, but Handlehan was surprisingly adept at playing the fool. By the end of the meeting, Malian's accusations had accomplished nothing but incite Handlehan to mark him down as the second demigod to be added to his collection. The capture of Malian went almost too smoothly. Though Malian has immune to our powers due to his divinity, he had chosen to live a life amongst mortals, and had even chosen a mortal wife. Handlehan managed to approach her and read through her memories, discovering each of Malian's weaknesses. Handlehan also asked for me to try and direct her affections away from Malian and towards himself, but I told him that I failed, as I would rather that he think that I was weak, rather than uncooperative. In the end, a demigod whose only power was to read books at an accelerated rate proved to be rather easy capture. With the aid of knowledge taken from his wife, Corg managed to sneak into Malion's keep and subdue him without much trouble. Once Malion was sedated and brought back to her citadel, Handlehan began to experiment. While Handlehan was busy in our ever-deepening dungeons, and Pleth was gathering followers beneath the banner of the One-Eyed Tree, Corg and I rode out to sow some general chaos. Corg needed to spread the fires of war in order to appease the god he served, while I had to figure out how to do something constructive with my time. In the end, I just ended up convincing generals who wanted peace that the only way they could obtain it was by preemptively attacking all potential threats around them. Somehow this satirical irony didn't particularly excite me in any way. While travelling with Corg, I found out that he didn't particularly trust Handlehan. If Handlehan did manage to figure out a way to transfer divinity, Corg feared that Handlehan might one day try and take away our powers. I found this to be a rather amusing idea, but I told Corg not to worry, since if Handlehan tried to betray us, at the very least, we could warn the greater gods to ruin whatever plan he had. This did not seem to comfort Corg, but cutting his way through an enemy army did seem to calm his nerves somewhat. At the end of the century, Handlehan made good on his promise, and showed us the dried-up form of Malion. The youthful appearance of a demigod had been taken from him, and ultimately, he never awoke from the sleep Handlehan had placed him under, dying some years later while under the care of his wife. But none of us spared a thought for our enemy, since Handlehan continued his demonstration by rapidly reading a novel in the span of a minute. Both Corg and I were rather impressed, and we immediately decided that capturing other demigods would be our current task for the next few centuries. When Pleth returned from his wanderings, we convinced him to absorb the divine essence of the animal-controlling demigod we had captured so long ago. With those powers added to his own, Pleth was truly a formidable force, and the cult dedicated to him flourished under his protection. Upon hearing that our first priority was capturing other demigods, Pleth agreed with Corg that we should try and capture a servant of the god of war. Corg already had a target in mind. He was a rival demigod named Brask, whom Corg had met many times in the battlefield, with each of their encounters ending with one of their temporary deaths. Corg suggested him because he'd be easy to locate, since Corg knew what areas he typically gravitated towards, and also because Corg had a good chance of defeating him alone, and a very good chance of defeating him with Pleth's aid. We found Brask leading a rather sizable but rough-looking army, and I spent a year following their band. It would have been a tough year, but my power made it rather easy for me to live amongst the soldiers, since I could direct any ear towards me, towards any other camp followers. My presence alone seemed to sap a great amount of the morale from the army, with everyone in a constant sour mood because I kept misdirecting their anger towards each other. By the end of the year, the army had been reduced to a third of its original size, thanks to casualties and deserters, and Corg couldn't wait any longer. The army that Corg had assembled within the year was quite impressive, somewhere near twice the size of Barask's. Barask, not being a fool, fled from Corg's army and held up his main force inside a castle. After Corg had finished slaughtering the outlying forces, he was stuck staring at a fully stocked and fully garrisoned castle. I had changed roles by then, from a camp follower to a castle attendant, and while I spent my days doing menial chores, I didn't bother doing anything over clever. Barask was very unlike Corg, extremely intelligent, to the point where if I acted too boldly within the confines of the castle, he might be able to trace any chaos I caused back to me. So I had to be content with simply using my power to sow misery everywhere, primarily by convincing people that the best way to ease their fears was to eat and pretend like everything was fine. Barask, whose divine gift was complete mastery over any weapon he held, spent a large portion of his time instructing his elite soldiers. Watching Barask, and imagining Corg with his skills, made me wonder if we'd be able to conquer the entire world after we captured him. The rest of Barask's time was spent defending against Corg, who was simply an utter asshole. Being on the inside of the siege, I realised that Corg was the worst kind of opponent you could ask for. Every few days, he would sit himself into a catapult, launch himself over the walls, slaughter as many soldiers as he could before either he got tired or Barask himself entered the fray. And then Corg would just run back and dive into the moat, just to return to his camp and give his fresh wounds a chance to mend. By the 5th time Corg had done this, I realised that he was really just playing around, trying to extend his last battle against his rival as long as possible. I often wondered why Pleth didn't simply overrun the castle with animals and trees, but not so much as I wondered what Handelhan was doing during all of this. With his food stores having been depleted far quicker than he had anticipated, Barask was faced with a hard decision at the end of the 3rd month. Assembling his last remaining soldiers, Barask decided to make an attempt to break the lines surrounding the castle, even if it meant leaving the other castle inhabitants, myself included, to fend for ourselves. Though the men would likely all be killed, and the women raped, and worse, it was hard for ourselves to hate the man, as Barask delivered a rather moving speech explaining his reasons, and how hard it had been to reach his decision. As Barask and his soldiers rode off, I helped the remaining men gather the women together, and for everyone to cram themselves into the innermost keep. There was an incredible amount of weeping, from the men and women alike, and I could practically feel how strong their desire to live was. I knew that the best I could do for them was to get Korg as soon as possible, and to stop his army from sacking the castle. But that all depended on whether Korg survived his encounter with Barask. Korg had allowed his men to spread the line too thin, and Barask easily broke it. He and his men would have likely managed to escape if Pleth did not command their horses to return. It was somewhat pitiful, with Barask's men screaming at their own mounts, which refused to listen to them, no matter how hard they kicked at their sides. With the horses gouged and bloodied by the time they rode right back into the centre of Korg's army, the soldiers upon them urged their commander to surrender. Barask, in a sign of complete surrender, threw down his lance and sword, all that separated him from a normal man. Korg was in a good mood, and offered Barask the right to duel for the lives of his men. Barask agreed to a duel at sunrise, which allowed me enough time to sneak into Korg's camp. We had quite a feast that night, celebrating our victory and our reunion. Pleth refused to celebrate, since he claimed he hadn't won quite just yet, but Korg feasted and drank until morning. The duel didn't start with any real ceremony. A ring of men surrounded Barask and Korg, and they simply rushed at each other. Korg showed no sign of wariness from having spent the night partying, and attacked Barask with a large club fashioned out of iron. Despite Korg's ferocity, Barask could keep up with the incredible speed of the club, dodging each blow and landing several of his own with his sword. When Korg finally landed a hit, a gruesome blow that crushed Barask's left pauldron, shattered his shoulder, crippled his arm, and drove him an inch into the hard ground. It was too late. Barask endured the attack, and then stabbed Korg several times, felling him. It was an unwanted outcome, but not unexpected. As Korg lay dying, shouting obscenities, we watched as Barask and his men climbed onto their horses and rode off, with none of Korg's men bothering to give chase. Pleth waited until Barask was riding close to a ravine, before he had the man's horse buck him off, a somewhat cruel end for a man who had endured so much. The rest of Barask's riders tried to stop their horses, but they continued right past their leader. While some men did jump off their horses, they did not manage to reach Barask before the mountain lion did, and the beast dragged him all the way back to Pleth. The crippled man was all but dead, and we tried far harder to save his life than we had to save Korg's, thankfully. Handelhan showed up, and managed to get Barask into a state of sustainable coma. He also explained how much he had learned thanks to his speed reading ability, and how he had become able to combine his two abilities, reading people's minds all the way to their deepest aspects in only a few seconds, having spent a good amount of time scanning the minds of the brightest people within his academy. By his reckoning, he had become the smartest person in the world. While Handelhan took Barask's battered body back to our citadel, Pleth and I tried to restore some sense of order to Korg's army. Without Korg's leadership, the army was reduced to an enormous gang of bandits, and to my dismay, they not only sacked the castle, but began to terrorise the countryside. Pleth ended up eventually managing to corral them with his powers, and even managed to make a good majority of them convert to the worship of the one-eyed tree. But that did little to alleviate the bitter feelings within me. I had spent far too long among the mortals. I knew, and it was difficult to forget the faces of the men and women weeping as they huddled in the bottom of the keep, their fates utterly outside of their control. When Korg, resurrected and angry, returned, he only stayed for a few days in the citadel before he rode off to fight in some war. It was several months before he returned, and Handelhan was forced to deliver him some unfortunate news. Barask had died a few days before Korg's return, though Handelhan had done everything he could to save his life. In the end, he had been forced to extract Barask's divinity in order to prevent him from being resurrected. Not wanting to waste what we had worked so hard to obtain, Handlehan himself had taken Barask's divinity. This story was plausible enough, but the shift in power had become rather dramatic. Korg had been counting on Barask's skill to bolster his own might, but now he was forced to contend with Handlehan's possibility of having the upper hand in a straight fight. Korg did not voice any of his anger, but I doubt Handlehan would have needed to read his mind to know what he was thinking. His only solace came in the form of Pleth, who we could count on being stronger than Handlehan and keeping him in check. But with Pleth being quite busy managing his cult and generally wandering, Korg felt far too vulnerable within our stronghold. Without wasting any time, he began planning our next capture, a woman he had heard about in rumours known as the Queen of the Archers, who was most definitely a demigod, if the tales surrounding her were true. Hey guys, do you like models in your tabletop role-playing games? 'Cause we do too. Do you like having big bitty waifus on your table? 'Cause we do too. We got human biddies, we got lizard biddies, we got orc biddies, oni biddies, cat bussies. We've got everything you want at neckbeardia.co.uk.
Check the links down below, it helps us out a lot.
Sorry for interrupting the video, let's get on with the story. I followed after Korg, and we journeyed far south. Here, the gods we served had different names than the ones we were accustomed to, but the god of war was still the god of war. We chased after rumours of the Queen of Archers, and I learned the useful trick of shifting a person's desire to not be killed by Korg into the desire to tell him everything they knew. It was still many months before we found her, dwelling among a large band of warrior priests. Seret was indeed a demigod, and she had the dreadful ability to never miss with her bow. After observing her devastate a group of bandits while standing on a distant mountain, Korg decided it would be best to try and befriend the woman. I was somewhat surprised, since Korg was the last person I had ever thought would try to avoid a battle. But as we melded into the group of warrior priests, I realised these people were just the kind that Korg liked best. After meeting with Seret, I found her to be rather amiable, and Korg was practically smitten with her. She was bold and beautiful, like most divine beings were, and could fire 4 arrows from her bow and strike the heart of a man coming from each of the 4 directions, utterly devoted to the god of war. I often wondered what she would think if she knew Korg was trying to unseat him. We spent several years simply following along with her band, with Korg suppressing his strength to mortal levels, but still leagues stronger than me. It was an odd time, because I don't think we actually had any sort of plan, and Korg was simply doing whatever he wanted. A part of me thought that he was still nursing the wound of losing to his rival in their final encounter, and I was more than willing to give him some time to settle into himself. We encountered some trouble in the form of a demigod who served the god of nature, who had mastery over fire and flames. His priests and the followers of Seret had clashed, resulting in a disastrous battle. Seret's arrows turned to ash as they neared him, and Korg was stubbornly trying to hide his divinity. In the end, I rode forth, my pride far exceeding my ability, and was charred to a crisp. Awakening in the halls of the Immortals, I realised it had been many centuries since I had returned there. I felt compelled to wander the pristine halls. Only once I had reached the Gardens of Desire that I realised why my urge to wander had overcome me. The god of desire did not want to approach me. He wanted me to approach him. Though he was a comparatively weak deity when placed among the greater gods, the difference between us was greater than that between a king and a rat that dwelt within the sewers. My god wanted to know how I had promoted desire throughout the land, and I could only answer that I had prevented people from reaching true satisfaction. I was offered a few bits of advice, mostly that denying people satisfaction for too long would simply kill their desire, but also that providing satisfaction would prevent their desires from growing too strong. Too strong desires, he warned, led to people's ruin far more than anything else. I thanked my god, then was left to wonder just how much the god of desire knew about my own desires. When I returned to the mortal world, I decided it was best to leave Korg to himself and spend some time with Handlehan. Mostly it was because I really couldn't just return from the dead without blowing Korg's whole attempt at purely pretending to be mortal, but was also because Handlehan had been spending too much time by himself. He asked me to help twist the desires of several people within his library and academy, and also allowed me to observe some of his experiments. Some of these were performed on himself, as he was trying to find a way to remove only a portion of a person's divinity rather than all of it, partially so that he could potentially transfer Brask's weapon skills to Korg. A more pressing goal for him was his attempts at increasing the longevity of mortals. While working amongst the researchers, I found out that Handelhan had actually managed to get himself a mortal wife a decade ago. When I asked Handelhan about this, he said that I should understand how powerful desires can be, and he had fallen in love with a researcher after reading her mind and becoming hopelessly enamoured by her. The fact that she was quite beautiful might also have a part to play in it. Though she was still rather young, it would only be a few decades before her lifespan was over, and Handelhan would not permit something like that to happen. With no captured demigods left, Handelhan was quite willing to give a portion of his divinity to his wife, but the hurdles he was facing were quite high. He had not only successfully split his divinity, but to successfully transfer it to immortal, something we weren't even certain was possible. In theory, there was a chance it would work, but there were so many complications that could occur that I was very reluctant to try before we were certain of what we were doing. But Handelhan was working on quite a strict clock, with his wife not becoming any younger. After assisting him with his experiments, he asked me to help either Pleth or Korg capture Demigod as soon as possible, in order to try and transfer their power to his wife. As I left to go join up with Pleth, he mentioned casually that he'd prefer if the demigod was a servant of desire. Pleth and the cult of the one-eyed tree were constructing a rather grand temple when I met up with him. After telling him about Handelhan's wife, which Pleth referred to as Handelhan's folly, I tried my best to persuade him to help Handelhan in his endeavour. Though Pleth argued that a mortal's death was as natural as their life, and that granting one divinity would go against nature, I bullied him by saying that we all owed Handelhan for his many years of hard work. After adorning ourselves in the garments of pilgrims, we left the construction of the temple in the hands of a young but brilliant architect, who promised to finish it within 30 years. With swarms of bloodthirsty birds and beasts surrounding the temple as its guardians, we journeyed off to meet with Korg. We listened to rumours along the way, with an ear out for anything that might lead us to a demigod of desire. After hearing our fill of bawdy tales, I concluded that unless every second brothel really did contain a demigod, we needed to change our line of questioning. Korg was in a much better state than when I last left him, though he had not managed to kill the fire-controlling demigod. My suicide rush had provided Surratt's followers a moment of reprieve from their flames, allowing them to escape. It had also provided Korg and Surratt something to mourn together. Though Korg apologised for shredding crocodile tears in my name, either way, he had grown quite close to Surratt, though she likely was starting to suspect his divinity. After reintroducing myself to Surratt as my old self's younger brother, she had enough tact to go along with it. Pleth immediately confessed his love for her, which led Korg to shatter the clay jug he was drinking from, but Surratt promptly recognised the joke for what it was. Korg listened intently when I told him of Handelhan's plight, and he too began to call it Handelhan's folly. He said it would upset all of our plans, and might even end up resulting in some terrible catastrophe. Even so, he agreed to help, and parted ways with Surratt's company. To our surprise, it wasn't long before Handelhan himself joined up with us, and the four of us couldn't help but celebrate our reunion loudly within the nearest town. As we recovered the next day, Handelhan explained his plan to us, which I didn't like from the very start, but withheld my comments until he had finished. In order to capture a demigod of desire, he wanted me to spur desire within the land, forcing it into the minds and lives of everyone. He wanted the worship of desire to grow until it was wild and in the open, and when demigods of desire would emerge proudly, he also wanted it done quickly. I was about to ask how exactly he proposed for me to do this, but he already had an answer prepared. He explained, would be to convince people that they would satisfy their yearnings for love with sex. I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted to argue with Handelhan, but he was quite certain his plan would work, but also explained that there naturally needed to be some opposition. He wanted me to spare the followers of the one-eyed tree, and they would serve as the gathering ground for the dissenters. with Pleth guiding his followers and Corg protecting me as I rode through the villages and towns. Handlehan would lay down a network to gather information about the progress of Desire and any potential demigods. It was an odd plan, but both Pleth and Corg were curious to see what would happen, with a decade as our time limit. They felt it was worth spending that short period of time indulging in Handlehan's plan, and if it failed, Handlehan could only have himself to blame. So I began my ride through the first town, clad in a cloak of red. Pleth assured me that there was none of his followers within that town, so I used my power on anyone I came near. There were no immediate effects, and when I rode out that night, I left the town without seeing any of my power at work. In the next town, clad in a cloak of green, I began my work again. It was odd work, because I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing. It was simple enough, as it was easy to convince people that sex was the proof of love, and to obtain sex was the same as obtaining love. But what any of that would do to further Handlehan's plans was anyone's guess. In the 6th town, while wearing a cloak of blue, I began to hear rumours. Likely it was because I was listening for these kind of rumours, but the housewives who stood at the street corners seemed to have plenty to gossip about. I rode throughout the country, Corg and Chaos following in my wake, and by the end of the first year, Handlehan said that he had some encouraging information to offer. In the part of the country I had ridden through first, childbirth had skyrocketed and brothels had more enormous profit, a clear sign that people were having more sex. When I asked what it all meant, he simply said to continue what I was doing, as the results would not truly blossom until somewhere around the 5th year. And so I rode, never spending more than a few days in each town I visited. I used my powers on beggars, soldiers, bakers, knights, lords, merchants, milkmaids, poets and scholars. On anyone unfortunate enough to come near me. By the end of the 5th year, I did not need Handlehan to tell me what was happening. I had underestimated people's desire for love. For some people, more than food, more than water, more than air, those people desired love. Seeking out sex when they desperately wanted love was proving to be quite a terror. The lucky ones managed to find some love amidst their sex, but amongst this number were the most unfortunate ones, who found love with their partners, but their partners did not find it with them. Most simply revelled in their desire for flesh, never managing to fill the gap that was their true desire. The people who never wanted love in the first place became one-eyed kings, thoroughly satisfied while leading all the rest to follow in their footsteps. In no time at all, the endless desire for sex, which was truly just the insatiable hunger for love, had consumed the culture, and the worshippers of desire found many new converts. In the 7th year, Corg and I were attacked by bandits. This was not something that had not occurred before, but usually a small show of strength from Corg was enough to send bandits running. These bandits, however, attacked with reckless fervour, ignoring Corg and heading straight for me. It was only then that I realised that Corg's motive for suppressing his strength while with Surt's followers had been. During those years, he had learned how to fight without relying on brute force, and his skill shone that day. The bandits were torn apart with little input from me, but they continued to recklessly charge, trying to get past Corg, as a crossbow bolt struck me in the thigh. I recognised that it was our turn to flee from a battle, but it was too late by then. As I was peppered by bolts, I took a moment to recognise the strangeness of it all. In the hallowed halls of the Immortals, I suddenly had the urge to rush over to the Garden of Desire and realise what a less than subtle summons of the God of Desire looked like. I didn't bother to see if I could even attempt resisting that urge, but had at least enough pride to trudge my way over there rather than skip. As I got nearer to the garden, however, my fear led me to skipping, and I was acting particularly giddy when I arrived in front of my god. To my surprise, after apologising for the rather rude summoning, he wanted to praise me for my efforts. When he had realised what exactly was happening among the people, he knew that I must be the one that was misdirecting people to seek sex when they wanted love. In no time at all, his worshippers had nearly doubled, and he wanted to reward my cleverness with any boon I desired. Now, I'm not particularly clever, but I could see a test when I was presented with one. When a god of desire asks you what you want, that's like the god of war asking how much do you like war. He was trying to gauge the essence of my desire, which, unluckily for me, was quite incriminating. If I told him any true desires, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't simply hand over all of his powers. If I asked for too little, that would be almost just as bad, and he would definitely suspect some deeper desire. As I considered my options, I remembered the whole original purpose behind me going around and making a mess of people's lives. Thinking about it carefully, I decided the best way of going about it would be to say that I would like an underling, a subordinate demigod. I had a mortal in mind that I thought would be a wonderful candidate for becoming a servant of the god of desire, and asked him to bestow upon her some of his divinity, and to allow me to guide her in his worship. My god was quite pleased with this request, since he seemed to think that my wish reflected a desire to expand his power, and decided he would grant it if he thought my candidate was suitable. Thankfully, he only needed a quick glance to deem her appropriate, and granted her the ability to make people dream about what they desired the most. As a final touch, he gave her a new name, Cumdra. Does that say Cumdra? Cum and Cumdra? Okay, give her a new name, Cumdra, to reflect that she was my apprentice. Now, Cumdra had not even known that Handlehan was a demigod, or that the gods truly even existed, which made all this quite a shock. I did not know how much I could tell her, how much Handlehan had kept hidden from her, and whether or not my spur-of-the-moment idea really had been a good one. So I made her a cup of tea, sat her down, and discussed how pleasant the weather had been recently. When Handlehan heard what I had done, he was livid. Making his wife my subordinate was not part of his plans, and having her become a servant of our ultimate enemies definitely wasn't. As both Cumdra and I tried to calm him down, I made the nearly fatal mistake of calling her by her new name. Had Pleth and Korg not decided to make a rather timely appearance, I might have found myself counting the stones in the deepest cell within our citadel. After the four of us managed to calm Handlehan down, I asked Cumdra to leave so we could discuss the next stage of our plans. Both Pleth and Korg agreed that things had turned out for the best, as Handlehan's ultimate goal of making his wife immortal had become accomplished, and we could stop with a plan that would likely have far-reaching repercussions. Later, Korg told me that I had accomplished a rather brilliant move, in that I now had the thing Handlehan cared about the most under my power. Considering that meant I had earned the ire of an immortal, hyper-intelligent weapon master who had the capability to rob gods of their divine essence, I didn't really consider that move quite so brilliant. Though Handlehan's goal had been accomplished prematurely, his plan was still rolling down its hill. By the 8th year, his intelligence network had already seen the rise of a powerful demigod of desire, who gathered worshippers under the name of the Midnight Mistress. Not wanting to waste what his plan had wrought, Handlehan decided it would be best if we captured this mistress and absorbed her power. With no reason to argue, the four of us headed out, leaving Cumdra behind to tend to the citadel. I had argued with Handlehan about telling her about everything, including our ultimate goal and the methods we were taking to reach it. But as he was her husband, and I only her teacher, his was the decision that was abided. Reaching the town where the Midnight Mistress was rumoured to dwell, I realised that though I might have set a spark, it was definitely other demigods that had fueled the flames. Draped in black, the town was a carnival of debauchery and desire, a giant temple to the darker aspects of my god. All that was sacred was all that was not, and flashes of carnal rituals came to us from behind jet-black veils and curtains which swung in the breeze. Pleth, who had spent years counselling his followers to respecting the divisions between love and sex, was actually somewhat repulsed by the sights. Judging by their ferocity, it was definitely no ordinary power that drove these worshippers, and I grew to suspect the massive brazier that choked the town with the smell of incense. Being demigods, we were immune to any enchanting power they might have had, but the strong scent almost had a power of its own. We were often stopped on our way to meet the mistress, but neither Handlehan nor Korg had any reason to delay the meeting. Cutting down anyone that stood in our way, Handlehan would only slow down long enough to read a person's mind to find out where the mistress was, before completing his stroke. Perhaps it was the smoke fogging up my mind, but I didn't bother to recommend a more subtle approach. We found her attempting to escape on a horse, but Pleth saw a quick end to that plan. Once she was thrown to the ground, she began to question us, trying to discover why we were after her. When she received no response, she removed her black gown and tried to strike a deal with us. In hindsight, one of us should have said something, anything, just so we could have gotten a bit closer and managed to knock her out. But we remained silent, and she decided to do something we had completely forgotten was in her capacity to do. She leapt backwards upon the massive brazier behind her, and her oiled hair and body were immediately engulfed in flames. We all rushed forward, trying to extinguish the fire, but even as Korg dug his hands into the ground and began to rapidly toss dirt over her, it was too late. She had returned to the halls of the Immortals, where the god of desire was waiting for her. We panicked. No one knew what to do, or what was going to happen. She had clearly seen all of us, and likely could guess that we were demigods, since we had not been affected by her incense. She had no way of knowing which gods we served, though she would likely think that we served the god of war, considering how 2 of us were coated in blood. If I were her, I would rush to the god of desire, tell him that something was up, and try to launch some sort of investigation. I had no idea how long it took to wake up after you got killed, especially since time was not a strict idea within the halls of the Immortals, but it was definitely our first priority to get out of town as soon as possible. Handlehand thought differently. He drew his sword, and before I had a chance to protest, lopped off my head. The halls of the Immortals is a beautiful place, but it's a place you can get tired of seeing. After waking up, I couldn't help but feel angry. He had obviously sent me as some sort of damage control, but what I was supposed to say to my god was an utter bloody mystery. I really doubt he would be convinced by any "it wasn't what it looked like" story. At that point, my brain only had one idea in mind, and that was to figure out what the mistress was telling my god. When I reached the Garden of Desire, I tried to mingle amongst the foliage, creeping my way towards where the god of desire held his audiences. He was not reclining as he usually was upon his massive divan, but sitting up alertly as the midnight mistress concluded her story. He was not pleased. From what I could tell, he had recognized my description. Why had I not worn a mask? Though he did not know those of my co-conspirators. Their identities was a small matter though, since the other greater gods would recognize their servants, but the god of desire was not certain it was worth troubling them about this. There were several possible reasons why the midnight mistress could have been attacked. He reasoned aloud, and in my great favour, he began to provide me with several perfectly plausible cover stories. It wasn't even certain that I had been intending to kill her, especially since as a demigod, I knew she would not truly die. But the mistress was a servant of desire, and she recognised our bloodlust for what it was. She practically screamed as she condemned us, saying our eyes had not lied, and that we sought her true death. The god of desire stared at her incredulously, since he thought of mere demigods possessing the power to kill divine beings was almost laughable. But he told her not to worry. If I did possess such a power, he would determine it the next time we met, by using one of his divine gifts to peer into my desires and see all of my plans and goals. My hopes of returning to the status quo died at that moment, since I doubted anything I could do would bypass my god's ability. The next time we met, our intentions would be known, and if I postponed the meeting, it would mean the same. As I said goodbye to our days of subterfuge, I saw a brief chance. If I wholeheartedly repented at that moment, ended my desire for power and replaced it with the desire to serve my god, I could spare myself at the cost of condemning my fellow conspirators. But the notion that I could simply snuff out a desire I had harboured for centuries solely at my own convenience passed as soon as it came, and I knew that my next step would have to be simply escaping the halls of the Immortals. But as I waited for my opportunity to leave, I felt a compulsion unlike any I had ever felt. It was a command I had known before, the one that urged me to come to the Gardens of Desire, but at a magnitude that left my heart with no other desire. My god wanted me within his gardens, and the only thing that saved me was that I was already there. The god of desire continued to pressure me, while casually telling the midnight mistress that he had summoned me, and that I would even commit suicide to reach him. His servants would rush to him as soon as I arrived in the halls of the Immortals, heralding my approach. They would then only have to wait until I arrived, and then all would be revealed. They waited, and I realised something a bit amusing. My god had replaced all desire within me with a singular purpose, one that was already fulfilled. I was basking in ultimate contentment during a moment where I should have been fearing for my very existence, satisfied beyond all my wants. If I was to ever come close to enlightenment, it was definitely in this moment, satisfied while in the Garden of Desire. While I sat, meditatively, deep among the fawns of the ferns, the god of desire proved to have no love of patience. He commanded and demanded me to arrive at the Garden of Desire with even more fervour. But in a realm where the meaning of time ebbed and flowed, My continued absence made it quite clear that I would not be coming. I had often questioned the nature of the divinity of my god. I knew he was incredibly powerful, but I did not know how much of the human nature was within him. I had never seen him show any emotion beyond pleasure, disdain, and anger, the emotions you would expect from a god. But that day, I saw a new emotion. He was afraid. He had poured all of his power into bringing me to him, and I had managed to resist. Even though this was completely untrue, in his eyes, I was a being which had powers he did not understand, and the thought that I could resist the desires of the god of desire troubled him greatly. Without a word to the stunned mistress, who could not comprehend the expression on her lord's face, the god of desire left his garden in order to counsel with the other greater gods. Recognizing as a good chance as any, I left the garden and travelled through the halls, allowing them to lead me to where I wanted to go. As I appeared in the citadel, carved into the top of our mountain, it was only moments before I was surrounded by my 3 co-conspirators. They each bombarded me with questions, but the feeling of complete satisfaction had not left me yet. I ignored their individual questions and simply began to recount what had happened to me after I had died. When I had finished, I realised something that I should have been angry about, but I was too content to care at the moment. I asked why Handlehan had killed me, and what he thought it would have accomplished. He took his time answering, and he told me that being in the halls of the immortals often offered a demigod opportunities when he had none elsewhere. The other reason, he said with some hesitation, was that if I was sent alone up there, I might have been the only one punished. I listened to both of these reasons and simply smiled, too satisfied to become angry. As they convened to discuss what needed to be done, I strode off to have a chat with Cumdra. When Handlehan found us an hour later and realised I had told her everything, he would have sent me right back to the halls of the immortals if Korg had not managed to grab him from behind. I was still far too satisfied to take his look of hatred earnestly, and I wasn't even able to truly see Cumdra's look of horror as she tried to comprehend what her husband had done over the last few centuries. It wasn't until Korg released Handlehan and walloped me in the head that my full sense of enlightenment passed. We had very little time, they explained. I had been lucky once, but the next time the god of desire wanted me in the halls, I had no chance of resisting. As I was now, I was just a massive liability, waiting to be summoned and to have my guts spilled out before my gods, in more ways than one. Pleth, Korg and Handlehan, not being servants of desire, were not in quite so immediate danger, though now Cumdra, thanks to me, was in almost the same situation I was. Handlehan began to explain his plan. Pleth had done quite well in the recent years, and was likely one of the strongest demigods of nature. Though it was still too early to challenge the god of nature directly, he would be able to stand on his own and continue to gather followers, even if his sect was considered heretical by other nature worshippers. With armies of trees and animals at his command, he would be able to endure, perhaps even flourish. Korg and Handlehan had no cult of their own, but the academy was ripe to harvest some scholars to worship a new god of knowledge. Korg would protect Handlehan's followers, who would continue Handlehan's research. I, being a calamity waiting to happen, was to be put to sleep. While dreaming, I would be unable to respond to my god's summons, and when Handlehan managed to produce some countermeasures against my god's urges, I would be awakened. Cumdra, cursed with the knowledge and the divinity I had given her, would also have to be put to sleep. They sealed me within the deepest chamber of her citadel, so far down that the stones of the walls were nearly hot to the touch. I was given a vial that Handlehan told me would make me sleep, until I was awakened by a similar draught, and told that even if no countermeasures had been found yet, I'd be awoken in 1 century's time and told of their progress. Cumdra would travel with Handlehan, enclosed within an iron ark. I apologised to her, saying I never intended for her to go through anything like this, but she calmly thanked me for telling her the truth. As I laid myself down on my uncomfortably warm stone slab, she promised me pleasant dreams. When I awoke next, I was alone and in the dark, still sealed within the chamber. I struggled with the stone door, hoping that a decade of pressing against it might yield me for my freedom. With no need for food or water, or really even air so much, I continued to press against the door, hoping time would favour me. I knew I was constantly in danger, since I never knew when I would be compelled to kill myself in order to reach the Gardens of Desire, but my time spent in the dark was a singularity of uneventfulness. I had a great amount of time to think, but with every thought being nothing but doubts and fears, I preferred to focus on the door. Several eternities later, the door was pushed inwards, throwing me backwards. As light filled my chamber, I saw Korg standing before me, a wild mix of emotions upon his face. When he asked what I had been doing, I replied honestly, and the mix of emotions turned into a simple and pure laughter. When he had finished, his expression turned grave, and his news was not much better. It was the 3rd century since I had been put to sleep, and there was a reason I had not been awakened earlier. In the 1st century, things had gone according to our plan. Handlehan produced a cult of scholars, while Pleth built up his worshippers to a small empire. The one-eyed tree had developed from a simple cult to a full-blown religion, partially due to Pleth's strong stance on morality. Compared to other nature worship, his religion did not embrace a sense of neutrality, or a nature-first mentality, but strove towards encouraging harmony and focused primarily on the good aspects of nature. People began to flock towards his grand temple, which the young architect finally completed on his 100th birthday. Deep within a primeval forest, it was practically a natural fortress, with thousands of followers offering the one-eyed tree their adoration, and hundreds of pilgrims arriving each day. However, near the time I was to be awakened, the greater gods made their move. It was a simple maneuver, something that was almost elegant. It was something I suspect the god of knowledge spent a good amount of time preparing, slowly gathering all the information he could before performing. When Korg was absent, a team of demigods captured Kumdra's Ark. Handlehan had been overpowered, and with his wife in the god of desire's possession, he was offered a choice. When Korg returned, Handlehan turned on him. Though Handlehan had Baras's skills with weapons, Korg was not the same as he was when Barask had defeated him all those many years ago. They duelled, but Korg saw no victory in killing his once ally, and before the other demigods came to Handlehan's aid, Korg fled. From then on, Handlehan fought against Pleth and Korg, and by the end of the 2nd century had become their chief advisory. Every move they made was countered, and without Handlehan's research, they found no new weapons for their battle. Thankfully, the greater gods banned Handlehan from doing any more of his experiments with divinity, so Handlehan was forced to rely on his extreme intelligence, weapon skills, mind reading, and subordinate demigods, all while backed by the greater gods. Pleth's worshippers, who were already branded as false believers by all the other religions, had most of their members killed or forcibly converted. Soon, his religion had dwindled down to a cult, with his grand temple reduced to an overgrown ruin. Korg was constantly on the run, fleeing from demigods of war. Though he had slain several, they would not remain dead. Yet, Korn's death meant being captured in the halls of the immortals and truly executed. It started to seem like a hopeless battle, but there was still a glimmer of hope left. If he could reach our mountain citadel, there might be some remnants of Handlehan's experiments, and perhaps Korg could figure out how to take the divinity away from other demigods. Korg had hidden for several years in the bottom of a deep cave, biding his time. He then began to tunnel, with nothing more than his bare hands, and after many more years and many hundreds of miles emerged, somewhere not too far from our citadel. When Korg opened my door, he was surprised to find me alive. Handlehan had told them all, without any sorrow, that with my divinity cut off from the god of desire, I had no way of sustaining myself. Though they had also been cut off from their gods, Pleth had his worshippers, and even Korg had managed to gather some people who admire the legend of unmatched warrior who wielded an iron club. But by everyone's reckoning, I should have been dead, with no one to offer me a single prayer. Though I was indeed alive, I didn't quite feel it. As Korg explored the dungeons of our long-abandoned keep, I tried to allow what he had told me to sink in. The biggest shock was Handlehan's betrayal, but not so much in that it had happened, but that he had waited until he had no other choice. Korg had been right about not trusting him too much, but I reminded myself just how far we had gotten thanks to him. Though the citadel had been empty by Handlehan many years before, completely stripping the library of god lore down to its last book, he had managed to overlook some parts of the dungeons. In one chamber, hidden to all except Handlehan and Korg who had dug it out, we managed to find an enormous cauldron, along with some enormous open glass containers filled with some obscenely foul sludge. Gathering the notes scattered around the room, we slowly discovered the terrible process Handlehan had used to extract divinity from demigods. The putrid ooze within the glass containers was, as confessed in the notes, nothing less than utter distilled evil. The blood of a demigod preserved and corrupted with unspeakable rituals. It was all that was vile given in liquid form. Submerging a demigod in something so foul forced the divinity out of them, which rose to the top and could be skimmed into a small container, to be drunk by the one who received the divinity. As I looked through some of the rituals used to distill the ichor, I was horrified to the point where I questioned whether or not we could use it. Korg shared similar feelings, but went ahead and justified ourselves by saying that the sacrifices had already been made, and it was a waste not to use the distilled evil. Korg was never a person I considered overwhelmingly intelligent. He was far more fond of brawn than brains, but there were some things that he knew more about than even Handlehan. Military strategy was one thing, though he rarely bothered to use it, but weapons were another. Korg spent the better part of a year reading through the notes Handlehan should have destroyed, figuring out ways to weaponize the ichor. During that year, I left the citadel, journeying towards the temple of the one-eyed tree. I tried to stay away from villages and towns, but the ones I passed had quite changed from the ones I had remembered. Mortals had advanced their technology slowly over the last 300 years, but the culture had changed dramatically. Shrines to the Midnight Mistress were almost commonplace, and shrines to other demigods, which were once hidden, also had been brought into the light. Every vice was now applauded, and the worship of desire was greater than any other. Heralds shouted nothing but brothel prices and the dates of new shipments of slaves, while beggars prayed in the streets for someone to purchase them. When I reached Pleth's temple, I was surprised to see that he had aged. I had always remembered him as a young man, and even after he had grown greatly in power, I still thought of him more as a younger brother than anything else. But as he lost so many of his followers, and the divinity of the god of nature himself, he could not help but feel and show the weight of the years. The old man embraced me, praising the sun and the wind that I was still alive. How he didn't know, but it was not something he spared much thought over. As I told him what we had found within the citadel, Pleth became quite silent. When I had finished, he asked me whether or not we were ever meant to live forever. I did not know how to answer him, and he continued by saying that we had lived long and great lives, and did many wonderful and terrible things. We had each lived the lives of 1,000 men, and perhaps that was all we were meant to do. Pleth did not want to use the ichor. He did not want to fight anymore. He was old, and he was tired, and he was no longer afraid to find out what happened to a bad god when they truly died. Out of respect for him, I allowed the words to mull around in my head for a day, taking them as seriously as I could. But at the end of the day, I asked for him to ride it out with me, to journey beyond his temple. In the first village we saw, I forced Pleth to look upon what we had wrought. I had misused my power, and had encouraged other demigods to misuse theirs. Though Pleth's followers suffered under the hands of others, these people suffered by their own hands and desires. If nothing else, it was our responsibility to make things right. Pleth did not need much more convincing. As we headed back towards his temple, the trees shook with his anger, and I wondered how I could forget that Pleth had always been the strongest among us. When Korg finally arrived at the temple, he did not come alone. A band of warrior priests rode large wagons through the forest, along with a rather familiar demigod. Surette greeted me by the first name I had ever offered her, and embraced Pleth in a way that would have been obscene if it didn't look so comical thanks to Pleth's advanced age. Korg's scowl did not lessen as they erupted into laughter, but it melted as she deftly planted a kiss on his cheek. As we celebrated that night, Surette revealed to me why I had not died in my sleep. It took her some time to tell the full story, as she somewhat rudely kept bursting into laughter, and I wasn't entirely sure I appreciated what was so funny. The warrior priests of Surette had retold the story of the battle against the fire-controlling demigod so many times over the centuries. My role had grown and expanded until some of the storytellers swore that I had been Surette's faithful lover. As we battled the living inferno, I had plunged into it for the sake of my love, and battled inside the blaze's very heart. Whether I won or not also seemed to depend on the storyteller, but the legend of Cum and Fire Eater had spread across the southern lands and endured to this very day. When I asked what was so funny about all this, Surette replied she could never forget the expression of the great Fire Eater after I had run forward and was engulfed in flames, as if I had just suddenly remembered that fire was hot. Korg and Pleth laughed far too loud at this, but after some time began to discuss whether or not this might mean a change in my powers. As I was cut off from the god of desire and worshipped for diving into a fire, they thought that perhaps I might have attained a new ability. Several burned fingers and a loud round of laughter from everyone except me, and that notion was disproven. The next morning, there was no laughter, as Korg revealed the contents of the wagons. Inside were their containers of ichor, along with horrible contraptions that must have been Korg's designs. Pleth and Surratt looked at them with quite scorn, and I noticed that some of the contraptions looked like massive syringes. Korg explained his simple idea. Handlehan had applied the ichor externally, but done so because the ultimate goal of his method was to extract the divinity in order to infuse it into someone else. Our goal, at its ultimate level, was to kill gods. As Korg and Surratt rode off later that day, Pleth asked me what I intended to do. It was something I had been mulling around in my head ever since my brief period of false enlightenment, and the idea had grown stronger and stronger after all this time. I wanted to do the opposite of what I had been doing in the past. I wanted to shift people's desires towards things that would satisfy them more, not less. I went into the closest village and sought the beggars who were so poor that they wanted someone to take them in as a slave. I offered them no alms, but slowly, carefully, I made them want to take control of their own lives, instead of enslavement. I felt a little guilty when their riot was put down in bloody fashion, but I continued my work, making every whore want respect instead of coin. I went to each store owner, convincing them that happier customers was more important than their profit margins, and the young men and women were told to seek out their true loves, not to settle for sex or comfort. To the priest of Midnight Mistress, I struggled to think of some way to use my power, but ended up just tripping over his brazier and setting fire to the shrine. It wasn't very long before I was chased out of the village, but when all the slaves realised that escaping to their freedom was less important than the death of their masters, it became quite the place to gather converts to the one-eyed tree. The desire bubble I had blown was long overdue for bursting, and as I travelled with Pleth as my guardian, we caused riots and chaos unlike anything that had been done before. Mortals no longer listened to the priests of desire and began to choose for themselves what they wanted. People no longer suffered through the easy routes, but struggled to get what they never even realised they truly sought. Pleth as an old man made quite a preacher, especially when people realised just how much they wanted to listen to him. It was almost as if they thought that a new religion would be able to satisfy their deep desire for order and morality. It wasn't long before the other gods took notice. They sent many of their servants after us, but with each town the worship of the one-eyed tree grew, as did Pleth's power. Horses threw their riders while trees ensnared them, and each of our escapes became easier than the last. Korg and Surratt had also been busy. When they returned to the restored temple of the one-eyed tree after an incredibly long 3 years, they had quite a story to tell. As we feasted, we were told of grand battles against other demigods of war, including one who had a terribly annoying power of always being able to raise his shield to block whatever came at him. Though Surratt shot arrow after arrow until all of her many quivers were empty, and the demigod's 3-inch thick iron shield held 1,000 or more shafts, he continued to advance towards her. Even as 10 men surrounded him, he blocked each one of their blows and cut them down one by one. When he finally reached Surratt, his victory certain, Korg ran forward and slammed his iron club so hard that the note that rang out from the shield alone killed several people and deafened the rest of the battlefield. As the demigod lay upon the ground, Korg forced the needle of one of his god slayers right over the shield that still managed to weakly rise. Despite the demigod's arm being nothing more than jelly held together in a sack of skin, Korg plunged it into the demigod's skull and watched as his divinity poured from his eyes, nose, and ears. There were several such tales, and having slain 6 demigods and absorbing their powers had perhaps made them the strongest of all the demigods of war. They did not return without gifts either, and presented us each with chained silver flasks. For Pleth, the essence of a demigod that could control the winds, who was slain when Korg tunnelled beneath him and dragged him underground. For myself, Surratt was quite proud to present me with the essence of the demigod who had killed me so many years ago, and even though a power of nature would ordinarily have gone to Pleth, She asked me to truly don the mantle of Cum, the Fire Eater. Amidst all this good news, they also brought dark tidings. The greater gods had not been idle, and Handlehan had proved his worth to them again. He had managed to create avatars for the greater gods, bodies upon the mortal realm that were indestructible, and allowed them to channel their full might. Korg Surret had been the avatar of the god of war upon the battlefield, and watched as he tore a castle asunder with a single wave of his flail. This news was grave indeed, especially when it followed with signs that the greater gods were tired of our continued game. Korg Surret had returned not to share stories, but to gather our forces in order to challenge the greater gods and the demigods they had assembled. It was much too soon. Pleth's worshippers had grown tremendously, perhaps to the point where he even rivaled the god of nature, but I had no followers to my name beyond some southern storytellers and children. Korg Surret, though, they now tangibly radiated with power, could not hope to defeat both the avatars and the demigods, no matter how strong they might have become. I knew then it was not a question of choice. The greater gods were coming, and we had no one to offer our prayers. Korg and Pleth did not waste any time. That very night they began to construct defences, with Korg using one of his new powers to summon the souls of war engineers to dig massive trenches and build high walls. Pleth had the forest grow and grow and grow, until there were trees that were wider than houses and several hundreds of feet tall. I struggled with the control of flames, which proved far more difficult than simply willing them to do as I wanted. More often than anything else, I would try to either shift or grow a flame, but would only end up snuffing it out. At the end of the week, I had to console myself with the idea that extinguishing fires was likely just as useful as a power as creating them. Had I more time, I would have earnestly liked learning how to create towering infernos, but the gods were not quite so patient. We heard them coming many hundreds of miles away, a grand procession befitting the powers that governed the world. Pleth and Korg's defences were impressive, even more so considering how little time they had. Massive trees stalked enormous cliffs like lumbering giants, each of them equal to a small army. And we had a small army as well, in the form of skeletons powered by the souls of fallen warriors, brought back to the mortal realm by Korg. Animals of every species had assembled, and Surret's warrior priests manned catapults and ballistas. Standing upon the roof of his temple, Pleth looked far into the distance, reading the winds and listening to the chatter of birds. Next to him stood Surret, her bow drawn, and wall of arrows arranged behind her. Korg had rushed to the front lines, not even bothering to say anything like a farewell, and I was in the temple courtyard, desperately trying to make something that was remotely like a fireball. The battle broke rapidly. Demigods, most of them servants of war, battled against animals, trees, skeletons, the wind, and a hail of arrows and stones. Each of their struggles was likely worth an epic poem, but most of them did not manage to make it within a mile of the temple. The brave few who did were slain by Surret's arrows, which always struck their targets, and now also exploded when they did. When Surret pointed out that she was certain she had shot the same flying demigod 4 times, I nearly collapsed at the thought. No matter how many demigods were defeated, they simply returned, whole and rested, while our forces were slowly worn away. If we had any chance of victory, it would have to be Korg, fighting near the front lines. He had left with a set of Godslayer needles, and was going through them rapidly. When he returned, I didn't recognise him, for he had grown to be 11 feet tall, and had a spare set of arms. He only stayed long enough to get a fresh supply of Godslayers, and then ran off once again, his iron club in one hand, and an endless scream ensuing from the other. The next time he returned, I thought he had obtained the power of flight. When he didn't slow down and slammed through the temple wall, I realised that he had been thrown. The avatar of war was not far behind, a golden flail in his hands as he leapt. I ran to Pleth to try and get him to help Korg, but he was fighting his own battle. The avatar of nature had summoned beasts from a time forgotten, and they were devouring the other animals. The giant trees withered as they neared him, and Surret's arrows blossomed into harmless flowers as they struck him. I urged Surret's warrior priests that they wanted to flee rather than fight, even as I knew that their lives were lost. As I watched horror struck, each of them found a partner, and with little ceremony, stabbed each other. A fine way to announce the presence of the avatar of desire. He had chosen the form of a beautiful woman, and with a wave of his arm compelled me to kneel before him, I kneeled immediately, but as he came closer, thrust my arms out towards him, summoning all the fire I could. It didn't even singe his long flowing hair or his sheer white gown, and I did not need his compulsion to tell me to stop when I did. As he stepped closer, more beautiful than anything I'd ever imagined, he simply took my breath away. I was in no danger of dying, as a demigod needed no air, nor food, nor water, but the pain in my lungs continued to increase until it felt like I'd actually eaten fire. I wept since I could not scream, and the god who I had called my god graced me with the most beautiful chuckle I had ever heard. He was amused at the thought that I had managed to resist his compulsions once before. There I was, not even his servant any longer, and I couldn't resist his simplest suggestion, even at the cost of such terrible pain. To my horror, while I remained kneeling in front of the avatar, Korg was thrown down in front of me, all of his arms torn from his body. He spouted blood from his countless wounds, and his iron club had been thrust into his lower back, piercing his spine. The Avatar of War did not even seem injured, laughing as he casually strode over, picking up Korg by his leg, and began to swing him. With a snap of his wrist, Korg's leg tore off from his body, and Korg was thrown deep into the forest. The Avatar of War let out a low whistle as he dropped the leg, and ran off to chase after Korg. A fitting end for all of us, I suppose. I didn't even want to know what was happening to Pleth at the moment, nor did I like the idea of Suret's fate. We had lost, and would lose everything, wholly and completely, all because we had desired power beyond our grasp. In utter agony, I dove right past desire and sought pure oblivion, praying to my god to simply kill me. But the Avatar continued to watch me as I made pitiful gagging motions, sometimes offering me a chuckle that sounded far less sweet. But as I continued to ask for death, the desire seemed to slowly lift from me. For the briefest, purest moment, I thought that I was being flooded with hope, and was about to embrace it wholeheartedly. But I had not lost my wits, nor the agonizing pain. I had been a demigod of desire long enough to know when my own desires were being tampered with. The Avatar of Desire did not want me to wish to die so badly. The Avatar of Desire did not want me wanting to die. The Avatar of Desire did not want me to die. I did not know why. Can't honestly say I really cared. It could have been because he wanted to torture me for a bit longer. Or maybe it was because really deep down, somewhere, he really cared about me and wanted to be best friends. All I knew was that if I desired anything at all, I was going to do my best to deny him. I fought through the pain, knowing that was far easier than to try and fight the Avatar's compulsions, and struggled to form a single image in my mind. Thankfully it wasn't quite hard, since it already felt like there was fire in my chest. As I burst into flames, I remained in the mortal world just long enough to see the Avatar's look of shock. It was pleasantly cool when I awoke, and was startled to see Handlehan standing above me. I didn't jump or shout, or even try and get some distance between us. I just calmly sat up, turned to him, and said hello. He offered me a hand, which I took, and he helped me up and asked me what was going to happen next. Before he said anything else, he asked me if I had come here because I had remembered him saying long ago that being in the halls of the immortals often offered a demigod opportunities when he had none elsewhere. I lied and said I had. Smiling now, he explained that the avatars were designed so that a portion of the greater god's powers, along with their consciousness, was sent down to the mortal realm. That meant that the rest of their power remained in the realm of the gods. He had actually been stationed in the halls, along with a number of other demigods, to help protect the defenceless bodies. Of course, none of these demigods had been aware that he possessed the skill of Barask. It was perhaps the first time I ever genuinely wanted to go to the Garden of Desire. There, the massive sleeping body of a greater deity reclined on a divan, and I took the moment to ask why he didn't simply wake up. Handlehan smiled, and said he had spent quite a long time developing those nearly indestructible avatar bodies, so it would take quite some effort for the gods to off themselves. Smiling, Handlehan then produced a dagger, coated it with dark liquid, and plunged it into the God of Desire's heart. There was a rush of shining liquid, and at first it seemed to surge towards Handlehan, but almost as if it had caught my scent, it curved around him and splashed onto me. As it continued to pour from the god's corpse, I felt a power beyond all knowledge, beyond all words. When I had finished absorbing the power, I realised that the garden had changed, no longer loud and tropical. It was a serene glade with a few scattered trees. Handlehan stared at me, and I searched his heart, learning his truest desire, and with a mere thought, Comdr appeared before him. While their reunion was quite touching, I was 1,000 billion million suns of burning energy, and I had some business I needed to take care of. Switching Handlehan's desire to a more pressing one, we strode off towards the Library of Knowledge, where the God of Knowledge resided. He told me he knew I would be coming. He also said he knew that Handlehan would double cross him. He also knew that the outcome of the battle between knowledge and desire would be. He knew quite a lot, which is why he didn't even bother to resist as Handlehan cut him down and absorbed his essence. Handlehan immediately began shouting about how much he knew and how I should be in utter awe. When I managed to calm him down and asked him if he knew what our next step would be, he said it was to send Comdr down and have her kill Korg and Pleth before the other two deities had a chance to realise what was happening, and help them obtain the power we had sought after for so long. Before we could congratulate ourselves, we found ourselves within a grand chamber with walls that stretched beyond space and a ceiling that might have also been the floor. There, the other greater gods had assembled themselves, and they began to judge us each in turn. All of our deeds, all of our thoughts, all of our dreams and desires, all of them were laid out before the gods in a single instant, or perhaps an eternity, and the greater gods began to speak as if they were one voice. Korg had proven to be a fighter beyond all others, learning from each defeat and rising to victory in the end. When the gods asked themselves if he should become the new god of war, only the very minor god of dissension was opposed. Pleth had upset many of the laws of nature, and our conquests and battles had left their scars upon the world. But nowhere could you find a person who held a greater compassion for nature, and few who had greater compassion over all, and he was applauded by most. Handlehan had performed terrible, horrible, unspeakable things. Most of the gods were repulsed at the very thought of him, and him having brought distilled evil into the halls of the immortals was a crime beyond punishment. Yet, he had done it all for the sake of knowledge, and it was agreed that after 3 cycles of eternity within the endless void, he would be instated as the god of knowledge. Until then, Comdr was deemed relatively pleasant, and it would be nice to have a goddess of knowledge for a change. The greater gods thought I was sort of okay as far as a god of desire was concerned, but none of them felt really compelled to not let me be a greater god. They also requested that I get to work as soon as possible. We left the chamber, a sense of accomplishment radiating from us. Before he left to journey into the endless void, Handlehan sent some of his new servants to deal with the crippled avatars. Only half conscious, the avatars could barely resist as they were thrown into a volcano, which Handlehan assured us would likely destroy them. Korg took a moment to apologise for ever thinking that Handlehan was anything other than a great friend, and they embraced like brothers. Pleth, once again youthful, grabbed me by the shoulder and pulled me towards the god of war and the god of knowledge. Our challenges were just the beginning, with all the responsibilities of greater gods upon us. But as we stood there, arms around each other's shoulders, we promised we would never forget the time we had spent as barely gods. The end.
Well, guys, what do you make of that? Now, to me, I really felt like in this story, this was like a reimagination of the gods of 40k, like chaos, like, you know, Handlehan being Zeech, like, you know, god of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
You got Cum. I can't believe his name was Cum, but
tell me that's not how you pronounce it.
it was Cum. Cum being Slanesh, you know, Korg, god of war, and of course Pleth being the god of nature, and all of them can be very easily reworked into the chaos gods. But to me, in this story, it felt very Olympian, very Greek in origin. Whenever I was imagining all the towns and the villages and stuff, I always just thought, no, this is Greece. This is Greece.
That's why it kind of reminded me of, especially whenever they were at the end and how big they were. Yeah. It reminded me of, is it the Titans or?
Yeah, the Titans. So originally in Greek mythology, the Titans. Then the Olympians took charge. They imprisoned them.
Yeah, it reminded me of them. So it did.
I thought it was so really good. But like, enough of that. We want to say a big thank you to all you guys that came across.
Thank you so much, boys.
Been watching the videos. It really is helping us out to no end. You got no idea. It really is just great. I actually love this shit. And we do have a Pride for monetization, but that normally takes within about a week or so.
Yeah.
So we're still kind of waiting for that, and once we know that we've got monetized, then that'll relieve the tension and the nerve.
And
I think
all steam's ahead then.
Yeah, and then we can
get the videos rolling out for you boys.
You know.
So, but
thank you. But as I say, we are demonetized at the minute, so if you're interested in models, it is the best way to help us out.
Yeah.
If you don't play with models, we have subclasses. If you don't actually play 5th edition or D&D and you don't like any of that, we do have t-shirts, and we are working on a few one-shots which I think are a lot of fun. I'm really happy and I'm really looking forward to getting them out. I just want to play test these, but I'm not going to give away what it's about just yet, because
but you boys don't
you guys will really enjoy it. We're going to live stream it and stuff.
Yeah.
And of course it won't. Look, I can't tell you.
Don't say nothing.
But look, again, also, if you're not interested in any of the merch, comment. Does help us out a lot. I do hate the term helps you reach our algorithm, but it actually fucking does, guys. And
share with your friends if you have a mate who's into tabletop or thinks he'll be interested in the story.
Maybe,
send it to them.
You've been looking at maybe getting into Godbound. This is an excellent Godbound campaign.
Yeah.
This is one of the very few stories about Godbound, and it's just a very good way of presenting it.
Yeah.
So again,
share, comment, subscribe,
all that stuff. It does help us out to no end. And
and once again, a massive big thank you. It really means a lot. Like, it makes my heart swell to see all the support that we have.
It's really nice. But look, as always, guys, we'll leave you to it. We'll talk to you guys in the next video. See you later.
Bye.